before I kind of go through the mission of the school, there's a couple things I always like to put on the table, because these are areas that there's a lot of confusion, not only with parents that are interested, but just generally speaking. American Classical Academy Rutherford is a school that is a public charter classical school. And I always start with that because to understand the work that we're doing, I think you need to understand public, charter, and classical. Most of us have some concept of what a school is. So I'm going to kind of break that down real quick before I go through this presentation. But a public school is funded by the taxpayer, meaning that any child that would like to come is able to come free of cost, and there's no specific what we call like a gleaning or assessing process, meaning as long as there's a seat, that child will gain that seat. If there are more children than number of seats available, then we have what is called a lottery. This school year, we will not have a lottery. There's not a need of one at this point. Well, it is filling up quickly. The lottery time has passed. So at this point, it's kind of first come, first serve. So if you apply at this point, we still have some seats kindergarten through 5th grade. In a public school, that would mean that those children would be seated. And that will remain open until August 12th when the school year begins. So again, a public school is a free, tuition-free school where it's open to the general public of Rutherford County. In this case, we have been approved as a charter school in Rutherford County. Therefore, you have to live in Rutherford County to come to the school. Charter schools. Charter school movement started really kind of in earnest in the 90s, so about 30 years ago. The shortest way to kind of describe what a public charter is it's a group of people, usually a group of parents, that would like to have a choice to as to where their children should be educated. And it's usually around a specific topic. So it could be various things. I've seen everything from college prep to career tech ed to aviation to basketball even. In this case, we are a classical school. But a charter school, a public charter school, is a school of choice that allows families to choose an option wherever they may live. So that's kind of a movement that started about 30 years ago. It's often called the school choice, this idea that parents should have an opportunity to have some different choices for their children in their education. And the last part is classical. We are a classical school. So most of this presentation will be around, well, what is a classical school? And what makes it different than other schools that I might be looking at. I think one of the simplest ways to start it, I'll get into, I guess, more of the abstract and the depth of what it is through my presentation. But there's some basic elements there. It's really a human education is where I like to start, meaning that there's some fundamental questions. Who are we? Like, what is a person? What is our nature? What does it mean to be human? What is our purpose? What does it mean to live a good life? Questions that have been around for thousands of years, and human beings have always been seeking and to understand those. So when a classical school seeks to educate a child, it's holistically, meaning they're not only trying to raise that child intellectually, but also morally and civically. And so all that is linked to this idea of what does it mean to be human. I'm not just a matter of intellect. I also have moral responsibilities and choices to make, and I'm part of a larger sovereign, a civic responsibility. The way that we talk about that is usually intellectual virtue, moral virtue, and civic virtue. So that's kind of a larger picture. I'll kind of break some of that down through this presentation. So that's what a public charter classical school is in short. Obviously, we could talk about this probably for quite a while. I like to start the presentation with the mission because we are very much a mission-led school. This isn't something I just kind of put up to feel good about what we're doing. You'll actually see this mission at the school, on the walls, in the handbooks. We talk about it because who we see ourselves to be very much guides the work that we do every day. So the mission of American Classical Academy is to train the minds and develop character in students through a content-rich classical education in the liberal arts and sciences, utilizing instruction in the principles of moral practices and civic virtue. All those words are deeply important. I've started to touch on some of those. So you'll notice stuff like train the minds and develop character. So not only are we trying to make them intellectually strong, able to read and write and think and speak and do math and science and history, those types of things, but we also want to be thinking about this development of their character, which is a very human thing, and it starts in our families. Obviously, parents are the first to start to form many of these things, so we see the parent as the primary educator, and we're coming alongside them in that work to make sure that we can supplement them. the best we know how, not only in mind, but in character as well. A couple other words in this that I think are important: liberal arts and sciences. There's often a lot of confusion around the liberal arts and sciences, especially in kind of a modern American narrative. There's a lot of politics around words like liberal, for example. The root of liberal is the same root that you see in like liberty. It has to do with freedom. So when we start talking about liberal arts and sciences, it's really what is an appropriate education for a free-thinking people. So if I am a free-thinking people, a free-thinking person, what is an appropriate education for me to have to be able to think freely? I think that's the best way to look at it. And when you look at the liberal arts and sciences, it's this argument that to be able to do that well, I need to be well-rounded in my thinking, meaning I should take various topics. I should be learning about not only having, language and reading, but also mathematics and science and history and art and music, physical education and philosophy and logic and Latin. The line of topics is long, but the idea is that I'm a better person if I have a well-rounded understanding of what it means to be human through all these different characteristics, and I'm thinking about it more wholly, not only to know about it, but to become a better human being by knowing those things. That I should seek wisdom is probably the good way to summarize that. That I should seek to understand better and to be better, and I can do that by being well-rounded. And then at the end of the mission, you see obviously moral practices and civic virtue, which I've kind of touched on a bit. I will put a little bit more on the civic virtue here. I think it's important to recognize that an education takes place in a specific place, a specific sovereignty. In our case, we're Americans. So it makes sense that we would learn about America and its history, not just because, but perhaps it's worthy of study and worthy of replication. There are some good things that we can learn from our history, and it's important that our students know that they're part of this larger civic responsibility. So what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to participate in this United States? And so that is part of what we do. Okay, the next slide, I put this up early because it's probably the most kind of grounded in the sense that you can see it. A lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about throughout this presentation is a bit of the abstract of what we do. It's kind of the bigger ideas. But as a parent, you may want to know what the school day looks like. And one of the easiest places to start is at the beginning of the school day. So we start every day. School starts at 8, it's over at 3. From 8 to 8:10, we have what's called an opening assembly, and all students and all teachers are there, and some other staff members as well. And it's a whole process. There's a kind of an order as we come to this assembly. We start the assembly with a Pledge of Allegiance, then we say a patriotic song, then we say this school pledge, and then we do a recitation, which is central to our work as well. So our school pledge, as you can see, is I will learn the true, I will do the good, I will love the beautiful. Well, it may seem like simple statements. These are statements that we could unpack for the rest of our lives. What does it mean to be true and good and beautiful, and to recognize it? Pretty complex questions, but we can start thinking about it at a young age. And it also tells the students that part of our purpose of being at school today is to orient ourselves towards what is true and good and beautiful, and start thinking about those things that we ought to know and do and be part of. And the last part is recitation. I won't talk too much about it, but central to a lot of our work is kids have to memorize poems, major historical passages, those types of things, and then recite them in front of their peers. It could be an individual, it could be a whole class, it could be a small group, and that starts at 5. So 5-year-olds do that, and ours eventually be a K-12 school. We're starting as a K-5 school and adding a grade every year. But you'll see 5-year-olds up there, and you'll see 18-year-olds up there eventually. Kind of going to the end in mind, so you can kind of think through why having children thinking about recitation and presentation early is that all graduating seniors have to do a senior thesis. And as part of the senior thesis, they have to present a 15 to 30 minutes presentation of findings in front of a panel and their peers. This allows them to use work texts that they've considered, books that they've read, and take a position and attempt to be persuasive in defending a thesis. And they do that not only in a presentation in front of peers, they also write a paper. That's usually about 10 to 20 pages as well. The reason why I mention that along with recitation is obviously if I'm a student, I've been accustomed to getting in front of others and having to say things from memory. I'm probably a bit more courageous by the time I'm a senior and having to get up and persuade a group of people around an idea, which is a big part of classical education. Not only should I know many things and start to be able to reason, I should be able to participate in rhetoric. I should be able to persuade, take a position, and basically discuss it reasonably as well as compassionately. So that's why I throw the school pledges to get you kind of thinking of the big picture of the work that we do. Many parents obviously have questions as to, hey, where's the building? So I put these pictures up. I think they're nice pictures, but I think it's only a fraction of how nice of a building it is. It really is a fantastic building. It's at 2 Ingram Boulevard in Laverne, Tennessee, obviously. It is about 100,000 square feet. I'll have more than enough room in it for a school of K-12. Frankly, a school that's usually a K-12 at our size with that, which at capacity we just under 700, usually need maybe 70 to 75,000 square feet. So this is more than enough space. The building has many great things about it. When I first saw it, I was excited. Everything from the security elements, which parents often ask about, like all the bottom windows, for example, are bulletproof, cameras, 2 doors that you need fob entry, everything from fire safety and safety as well. If you see the picture there, you can see there's plenty of space to have, we're going to start with 2 playgrounds, eventually a gym, fields, those types of things. It's definitely a campus where a school can be built. Our hope is that late July, early August, the parents will have an opportunity to walk around the building and see it and also meet their teachers. But that's kind of the timeline as now. Right now, you could drive past it if you like and check it out, but you wouldn't be able to go inside. Okay, so let me get into some of the theoretical framework of our work. It's a little bit heady, but I think it's important to recognize that a classical environment is a word-rich environment, meaning there's a lot of words, everything from what's being spoken back and forth in conversation to the number of books and texts that kids are considering. So you can imagine the theoretical framework around this is important. Obviously, a lot of our freedom as human beings is exercised through the use of language and our understanding of language and communication. So it's important to kind of set up these theoretical frameworks. I mentioned earlier in this piece that some of the central questions to our work is what is a human being and what is a good life? As you can imagine, as adults, those are questions. So if you have young people considering these questions, you can imagine that question, the answers to it become more sophisticated over time, and they're lifelong, meaning I don't think any of us can really fully grasp these things, but we can consider them at more sophisticated levels. So this idea of our humanity and our moral character and civic virtues, a big part is our work. And I said that earlier, but again, I want to substantiate that we see our work as an extension of what happens in a family. Parents are the primary educators of their children, and we come beside them to help them in the intellectual, moral, and civic growth as well. I put these 2 words up here really for 2 primary purposes. One, school should be a joyful and wonderful place. If I'm a child, I should be experiencing these things regularly. Even though learning is hard, it is a struggle, I call it a joyful struggle. Learning should be a joyful and wonderful thing. Wonder is the beginning of how we understand things. It's the beginning of our pursuit of wisdom. And so I think most of us can kind of recognize, especially in young children, this wonder in a school setting. But I think it's important to also recognize that that's the expectation of the adults in the building as well. If an adult is going to be in front of a child, especially as a teacher, they should be having a lot of the same joy and wonder in the topics that they're considering. And that's very much a classical kind of perspective on this, meaning that the adults that you put in front of children should be they should be adults that the children feel like they could emulate. They should be able to think things like, that person knows things that I ought to know, or that person is trying to live a life that I ought to try to live. And so a joyous and wonderful teacher in front of a child can have significant impact as far as modeling not only teaching, but what it means to be, I guess, more human or better at being human. So the school as a whole, while it has a specific kind of code to it and a decorum, it shouldn't be cold. It should be a joyful and wonderful place. And then finally, this idea that you should be learning basically because you should be learning. You should be seeking wisdom, that the reason why you learn is to become more wise, become more virtuous, not only intellectually, but morally and civically as well. And that's a lifelong pursuit. So it's important to recognize that a classical education is really centered around the idea that when a child graduates, a senior, an 18-year-old, they should be a well-rounded intellectual person, but they should be good and aware of their civic responsibilities. And the reason why I point that out is our work isn't to prepare them to become a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer or a plumber or an electrician. That's not what our work is. Now, we become those things, but a K-12 education is getting a child to be well suited to do any of those things. So I'm a good person who's a lawyer. I'm a good person who's a plumber. And that's something that I'll do, obviously, in a society like ours. Most of us have to take on some economic responsibility, take care of our families. And our hope is just that the people who do that are well-rounded individuals. So when you graduate from a classical school, you could go in a whole bunch of different directions. You could become a lawyer, you could become a plumber. Really, the idea is that you're well-rounded and you have choices because of your intellectual, moral, and civic strength. So that's kind of the purpose of a school. So that's kind of the theoretical framework. So what does that look like as far as practice? And that's kind of the second side of this slide. You can imagine there's a deep knowledge and analysis of literary works, a lot of them. We read full books from front to cover. And it starts very early, obviously, before I can read. Maybe if I'm 5, I'm having books read to me, and we're having discussions as a class. Our expectation is by the 3rd grade, they're reading well, proficiently, and could read independently. And so you can imagine our literacy program is very much focused on making sure that children read well by the time they're in the 3rd grade. And I'll talk a little bit about that literacy program in a few moments. But the idea is that I should be able to read books, and I should read good books. Books that have been around for a while, as far as they've always been kind of admired for how well they were written, or that they take on ideas that are really important to human beings. What does it mean to be courageous? So I can read about somebody who has acted courageously or prudently or is a good friend. All things that human beings have been focused on for thousands of years, but there's good books that people can read about those things. So there's a lot of reading. The example I often give in person is the 10th grade class, which I've taught at another school, the moral and political philosophy. To kind of give you an idea, it's a 1-semester class. The students start the year with Darkness at Noon, then they read 1984, Brave New World, Gulliver's Travels, and Abolition of Man, and that's 1 semester. So you can imagine if I'm 15, 16, and I'm having to read those texts, if you know anything about those texts, not only those relatively complicated pieces, they take on really high ideas. And so if you kind of have that end again in mind, the 15, 16-year-old, you need to produce kids young that are taking on, obviously, literature that's not as sophisticated, for a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old. But we read a lot of books cover to cover and have discussions in our classes around those things. You'll also notice it says original source documents. Again, for a human education, it makes sense to actually look at what a person writes. So a primary source or an original source. What did this person, what did this man, what did this woman think when they wrote, such and such? And we have discussions about those things, trying to find meaning and intention. An example that I think is an easy example to throw out there is the 4th graders read the entire American Constitution in the 4th grade. And they read the whole actual text, not about the text. They read the text and they discuss the text. They do that again in the 7th, 8th grade, and then they do that again in high school. So by the time they graduate, they've basically read the Constitution as a class at least 3 times. And they're discussing what they believe the intention of these writers was, and how it relates to life in general, but also to our specific time. So really just a strong focus on literary pieces and original text. Second bullet point, you see the teaching of the discipline of logic and the use of Socratic discussion. We actually start teaching logic, as a formal class in the 9th grade. That's kind of part of what is called the trivium in classical education, so grammar, logic, rhetoric. The best way to kind of think about that in our kind of modern context is K6 is the grammar stage. That's when we're basically sponges. We're getting the tools, just putting tons of information in our heads so that we have things to work with when we start to reason, which you really start seeing the question why around adolescence. So a lot of 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds start to get into wanting to know the purpose of something or why something is. And that's when we're starting to reason, putting all those bits and pieces together. And then the last stage, which I mentioned earlier, is rhetoric. I start taking my reason and hopefully my moral responsibilities and civic responsibilities and start to persuade around things that are true and good and beautiful. So that's that logic piece. And then Socratic discussions are basically teaching kids to have discussions that are really around the text. For me, this is one of my favorite parts of education, seeing students take a text and get into discussion and agreement and disagreement over something based on questions, but using the author's work to evidence why they feel so about the text. And then the last bullet point I think I've mentioned, the use of materials and pedagogy that have stood the test of time. The reason why classical education is quite interesting for most parents and otherwise is that these are processes that have worked over time. Classical schools aren't new. It's been a resurgence for most of us. Most of us that have kids today, younger kids, may not have been educated in a classical way, but historically classical education was quite common and quite effective. And so it's us just kind of bringing that back, tools that we know about how human beings learn in ways that's consistent with our nature. Okay, some practical pieces put out here. So at American Classical Academy Rutherford, what are some of the core things? And you can see this list. I started mentioning literacy earlier. The Literacy Essentials is a phenomenal K2 program. I can't say that lightly enough. It's really it's a phenomenal process to watch, but it's an explicit phonics. So the kids are seeing, writing, hearing, saying. So if you can imagine all the different ways that we do something, the children are learning to read through writing, which may sound kind of complicated, but it's important to recognize that reading must be explicitly taught. It's actually, and I could go into a long piece on this, I don't think I will in this context, but the way that I kind of put out there for parents to understand, if you think of reading is made up of various symbols, and symbols in a specific order. There's nothing natural about it, meaning if you think about a child being bored, you don't come out understanding what an A is, nor like why would you know what an A is? And not only what an A is, that an A has various sounds, and that these symbols actually represent sounds. Like, again, why would I know that unless I'm explicitly taught that? And so the students are taught 70 plus phonograms, all these sounds, and then they're taught how they kind of combine and start making words. And that has to be taught explicitly. And then, of course, that makes its way into grammar and those types of things, where the students learn the rules of language so that they're, in fact, reading and writing and understand what it is. It's not just trying to memorize the whole of a word, for example. They actually can read anything because they know the rules of the language. So Literacy Essentials is explicitly teaching a child how to read. I can tell you in the Literacy Essentials that I've seen among the students I've seen in the last several years, the vast majority, 90+%, end up reading quite well because they learn how to actually read. Core knowledge, I'm not going to go too much on that now, but that's basically the information we use for history and science in the younger years. I will touch a little bit more on Singapore math, because Literacy Essentials and Singapore math are the areas that parents usually have some difference in how they were educated or questions on. The easiest way to talk about Singapore math is this idea of conceptual understanding. It's not, most of us were taught like algorithms, kind of a plug and chug. This is, you get an answer by doing this, but you may not know why that answer really matters. So Singapore math gets children to understand that math, for the most part, has to do with quantity and patterns. And the reason why mathematics became a thing is that it was really in our desire to understand that the world we're in. I mean, I think the most obvious area would be the physical world through the sciences. Mathematics is often used for us to gain understanding. And if you don't see it as a tool to do that, you just see it as a plug and chug, just getting an arbitrary answer, then it's really hard for you to kind of fully understand and grasp why it's important for me to know math. But math is a tool that allows us to be more human in our understanding of the world that we live in. So that's kind of the simplest way I can talk about it. In person, I would show you a couple examples about how that plays out. I've talked a little bit about the grade books, obviously. The simplest way I put that is that all books aren't alike, and some books are actually better than others. And part of classical education is trying to make sure that some of the best books that we know of are in front of our kids for them to read. as determined by really thousands of years of history. Books like Homer's Odyssey that they read in the ninth grade that obviously has been read over and over and over again for over 2,000 years. Okay, so this you can actually find on our website. This is kind of the scope and sequence of all of our class, the curriculum. So if you want to, you can kind of look at your screen right now, but it's easy to find online on our website, rutherfordclassical.org. If you come to the meeting in person, I'll actually give you a copy of this. Things to notice, of course, I like to start at the bottom of that. If you look at the bottom, you'll see that art and music and PE are taught K-8. All the students take art, music, and physical education. So we see that as being a major part of a child's formation. I mentioned the senior thesis, so if you go to the 12th grade column, you can see the senior thesis there. You can also start in the 6th grade and see that Latin is taught formally starting in the 6th grade. The Greek and Latin roots are actually started earlier than that. Actually, it's 3rd, 2nd grade, not just strictly the 3rd grade. But I guess the question there is, like Latin, we get this a lot, like why Latin? What I like to start with is why it's not for the purpose of making sure you do well in SAT or SAT. Will it likely result in that? Yes, but that's not why we're teaching it. I think there's two primary buckets as to why we teach Latin. Latin has obviously had a significant impact on our language, those of us who speak English here in the United States, meaning that by studying Latin, you become more aware of your words and the meanings of those words, meaning Latin helps us understand that words have meaning, that we can't have true communication if we don't fully understand a word. If we have different definitions, for example, it's going to be very hard for us to understand each other. But it's also understanding that words actually come from roots that had oftentimes physical meanings. You know, the word definition, you know, the space between two things, like between two rivers, for example. You know, the word is what's in between. It's not what's on the other side of the river's banks, you know, that kind of a thing. Just getting kids to start understanding that. The other piece is a little bit more abstract. Obviously, Latin was spoken by the Romans, and the Romans have had a significant impact on American culture. So it allows us to have a better understanding of some of the roots of American culture. To give you an idea of how high students at our school could go in Latin, especially if they go up to the 5th year of Latin, they actually read the authors like Cicero in Latin, and they discuss it in Latin. That's how far they get in Latin. That's how educated they become in that language. So yeah, so those are just some examples. As you can see, a lot of the scope and sequence that are on that page as well. And again, as I said, if you'd like to see this with more time, you can go to rutherfordclassical.org and it'll be under curriculum. I put this up as a snapshot. There's actually a scope and sequence like this for every grade. So this is kindergarten. I'll show you 5th grade as well, but every grade. This is helpful for everybody involved. Obviously, if I'm a teacher, it gives me kind of a pacing to how I'm teaching throughout the year. But it also helps you as a parent to see what your child's learning. You know, so if you look at this and you have a kindergartner and it's February, you can look at literature and say, oh, are you guys reading Snow White? You know, what do you think about that? It just allows there to be that interaction between the school and the parent and the household to kind of get an idea. You also start to see how all the different content areas start to kind of intermingle and intertwine and be related to each other. I think an obvious one on that I always show in the 5th grade. If you look at this one in the 5th grade, you'll notice if you look at literature that starting in February, they start reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography, and they read that through March. If you don't know about Frederick Douglass, in short, was a man who was born into slavery. He eventually gets out of slavery, teaches himself how to read, and becomes one of the primary abolitionists in the Civil War era, really fighting against slavery. But if you don't learn about the Civil War, for example, so if you go down to history and geography, you'll notice antebellum America, which means America before the Civil War, and then you study the Civil War, it might be more difficult to understand why Frederick Douglass matters in this conversation. But obviously, if you understand slavery in the United States and why there was a Civil War, you know, in part, then Frederick Douglass's autobiography makes more sense. So that's just a good example of how you can see them intertwined and see what kids are talking about at that point. You can also notice, by the way, if you look at both the kindergarten and 5th, that the topics obviously are becoming more sophisticated. Okay, I put this up as an example schedule. It'll probably be the schedule. meaning I have no reason to change it at this point. You'll notice the opening assembly there at the beginning is from 8 to 8:10. And then you can see the various topics. I think the biggest thing to notice for me when you look at this is not only that they're hitting all these topics, but notice that it's made for a 5-year-old. So you have literacy right at the beginning of the day when they're the most focused. Obviously, that's the time they're most going to be focused, and literacy would be of primary importance. We want our kindergartners to be able to read well. But also notice they're 5. So you'll see there's recess, and then later on PE, and then lunch, and then recess. And then you'll see that there's music and art and recess, meaning that when I'm 5, it's probably harder for me to stay around in one place and focus. So moving to different places, moving around in those places allows me to get my wiggles out as we talk about it. So you can see that there. Also notice that there's a significant amount of literacy through that curriculum and a lot of math. So as you can imagine, we expect our kids to be very, very good at reading and very good at mathematics. Not that they shouldn't be good at science or history, but those early years, they should be able to read and do math so that they can more effectively do history and science and other topics as well. I put up the 5th grade as well, just so you can see it becomes a little bit, the periods become longer around history and science. Obviously, by the 5th grade, our expectation is that 5th graders can read well, so they have more time to read books and actually have discussions about the content of those books. And notice that they're 5th graders, so they're still young enough to like recess. So you'll see that there's a couple recesses in there as well. Okay, so I'm going to start moving pretty quickly through some concepts about our culture. Obviously, we have a culture that's set up where the students and the adults, it's all of us, desire to do the good and know the truth. So it's creating a culture where that is constantly the conversation. And one of the ways that you do this is that you create routines, decorum, procedures, this idea that human beings like order, and we feel safer in order when things are consistent and have pattern. So creating a school environment where I can learn and I'm focused on the learning, not necessarily all the procedures, but the procedures allow me to have an environment that allows me to focus on that learning. So you'll see, we call decorum or order. It's stuff like kids walking in an orderly line to lunch or to recess or to the opening assembly. And as they get older, for example, like high school students may not be as much of in a line, but they're still respecting the environment and they're having a quiet conversation with their friend as they're walking down the hall. So those types of things that get a child to understand the order of things, and that I'm at school, and at school we do school things. And this is part of how we do school. The next one, school learning positive attitudes are encouraged. I call this nerd culture, meaning learning's cool, and it should be. And the way I kind of figure out if we're being relevant in that sense, it's that I often listen to what kids are talking about. And I can tell you as a teacher, as an educator, you get quite excited when students are talking about what they're talking about in class, in the halls or in the cafeteria or on the playground. Because the topics that they're considering are important and they find them important. I would say it's equally exciting for me is when a parent calls me up and says, hey, I was talking about, whatever the book was or whatever the topic was in class, because that means for that child, what they're learning in school is important enough to bring home to the people who love them most and care for them most and wanting to have discussion with them about those topics. So we call that learning positive attitudes. I call it nerd culture, but just idea that seeking wisdom and learning, understanding and knowledge is what we ought to be doing. And then obviously high expectations for behavior and academics, this idea that I should desire to be excellent in all that I do. Okay, I'm just going to put up these. I'm actually going to put out pretty quickly. We have 7 virtues that we focus on: prudence, moderation, justice, courage, responsibility, friendship, and wisdom. When I say we focus on them, it's everything from discussions, presenting them in the assembly, to reading books about these things. I think one of the easiest places that it often comes up in questions is, what does the discipline protocol look like? It is a public school, so it's easy to talk about, oh, you could get a detention or a suspension or expulsion, that kind of thing. That's more of kind of a punishment. Discipline, keyword learning, discipline, disciple, learning, that's the key word there, is coming alongside a child and having conversation. So the example I give as an administrator would be like me talking to a child and saying, hey, do you think that what you just did was a prudent decision? Some of my favorite memories of kids kind of stopping and thinking and then going, Mr. Schwank, I don't think that was a prudent decision. I didn't really think about what I said before I said it, which is showing me that this child is increasingly understanding what it means to be prudent, that sometimes I should take a step back before I do something or I say something. So these become just part of the larger characteristic of our school. And as you know, probably as parents, oftentimes we have to tell students many, many, many times to habituate what it means to be prudent or moderate or just. So these are our virtues. They're literally, you'll see them on the wall. They're constantly part of the discussion of what we're doing. You see it in the literature. There's discussion around these things. These next couple of slides are basically the same. Just this next slide, for example, you'll see we have statements that help them start to understand what they are. So if you see this, you can look at prudence. I will make wise, well thought out decisions before acting, or you can go down to courage. I will do the right thing even when it's unpopular or difficult. So just getting, even at young age, children starting to think about these ideas. The next couple slides are basically those statements with, popular art pieces that demonstrate those virtues. You'll likely see these around the school as well. Okay, so a couple slides I'll kind of read them out to you and talk a little bit. A different kind of education. We all want our children to live good lives and pursue happiness. We also understand that education helps them achieve this end. We seldom consider, however, what a good education is, and often when we do, our measures do not equate with happiness. I think that the thing to focus on this is the idea of this pursuit of happiness, which we see in our historical documents here in the United States. And what do they mean by that? I think in the modern context, we struggle with this word happiness. I think we often cross-reference with pleasure, and happiness isn't necessarily pleasure. Historically, the idea of happiness was kind of the convergence of good and truth in relationship to others. So where does good and truth come together? Living in that way, living goodly well, and living truthfully in relationship to others. And that's where happiness lies. So kind of unpacking what happiness is and why we should pursue it, especially in a larger society. So American Classical Academy Rutherford is built on the premise that if the aim of education is human happiness, we must structure our efforts on what is most conducive to achieving that end. That begins with understanding what happiness is and is not. Okay, so it's like a slide again that's kind of divided. So happiness is not merely a fleeting or momentary pleasure. Instead, it is a lasting and enduring state of well-being that encompasses a person's overall quality of life. Aristotle suggested that we achieve happiness as a way of life by cultivating moral and intellectual virtue. The person educated and living virtually experiences happiness as a result of the proper ordering of the soul. So I think inherent in happiness is a certain amount of work. It's going to take a certain amount of struggle. It doesn't just happen, and it's often not easy. So if you look at pleasure in contrast is a more transient and sensory experience. It is associated with the satisfaction of bodily desires and the avoidance of pain or discomfort. Mistaking the presence of pleasure and absence of pain for happiness is an age-old habit. I think this is a pretty easy one to evidence. A lot of things in life that make you happy often may have pain or discomfort before it for you to get there. There's a struggle that happens for you to get to that thing. So if all we were doing was avoiding pain or discomfort, it'd be very difficult for us to really get to the point of being truly happy. So getting people to start thinking through what is just seeking pleasure or like hedonism versus what does it mean to really seek a happy life with others. And that's part of our work in a classical school. I'm not going to break down this too much, but just know that there's this idea of moderation. If you look at Aristotle, there's a continuum of each of these virtues, and these are actually even more than what we have in our school. The one that I often talk about, because I think it's relatively easy to understand, is the idea of courage. Courage is somewhere in the middle, which is true of almost all things. So as a quick statement about courage is something that I do where I know the risk of what I was doing may result in something not good or not something that I would enjoy or favorable, but I'm doing it because I am doing it in defense of something bigger than me. That bigger than me could be a whole bunch of things. I think a soldier is the easiest example of this, meaning a soldier may go to battle. And the soldier will go out into a battlefield understanding that they could potentially die, but they're doing it because of a defense of country or family or an idea. So they understand the risk. I may die doing this, but what I'm doing it for is a worthy cause, which is different than being a coward. Obviously, if I go into battle and I decide I don't want to be part of that and I run the other direction and I don't want to participate, that is the action of a coward. But the other side is to be reckless. I use the modern context with a lot of the war games that are video games these days. It could be the person running out into the field, just excited to have a gun and to be shooting at people, not really realizing the risk of what's happening there. That's reckless when they don't fully understand and comprehend what their action may result in. Not just for themselves, but how that would impact their family, for example. Okay. Quote I just put up by one of my favorite thinkers, C.S. Lewis: "The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but irrigate deserts." Just throwing that up there for you to think about and chew on. Okay. Our thinking at American Classical Academy Rutherford is that early and often students must learn right from wrong and all their ways of relating to others. This does not happen innately in humans. It must be instilled in us through constant example and repetition that teaches us to do what is right and forego what is wrong as a matter of habit. To kind of summarize that, we have to be taught. We do not innately. We don't just naturally know what we should do. And anybody who's raised a child knows that. So part of our work is to constantly try to create habits that are the way that we ought to live in the world. And like I said earlier, this is an extension of this, what happens at home. So it's constantly trying to habituate them into being prudent or moderate or so on. But it's from a simple recognition. Human beings do not naturally seem to know, or at least know how to make the right decisions. Oftentimes, we have to train ourselves and each other to make good decisions, especially children. Okay, so intellectual virtue, I feel like I've kind of undone this. Well, I'll read through it. In striving to encourage students to do the right thing, we also recognize the interconnectedness of moral virtue and intellectual virtue, which I've talked about. An ideal education amounts to developing both the habits of the heart and the mind. Developing practical wisdom, common sense, and good judgment is best achieved through an education that emphasizes the pursuit of truth, moral goodness, and beauty. So just to put that out there again. So what is classical education? Because it is the most time-tested means of pursuing truth, goodness, and beauty. You hear me saying it over and over again. You can imagine it's a major part of our work. It's rooted in centuries of tradition and dating back to the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. It places a strong emphasis on students thinking deeply, asking questions, and engaging in thoughtful discourse. A classical education covers a wide range of subjects, including literature, history, mathematics, science, philosophy, and the arts. This breadth of knowledge encourages students to make connections between different subjects. Okay, so the purpose of this approach is to teach children how to think by placing before them at each stage of learning age-appropriate models. Let me focus on that. We learn differently at different ages. It's important to recognize that. What you put in front of a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old shouldn't be the same thing because they're not thinking about the things the same, or it may not even be ready for certain things that you could put in front of them. So this idea that we recognize that children learn differently at different stages. I've kind of touched on that with the idea of the trivium, that there's idea of grammar, logic, rhetoric, that children at different ages need to be having material that is best suited for them at that place. So this idea of the stage of learning age-appropriate models of how one should learn for truth, goodness, and beauty, and encouraging them thereby to develop the same habits of curiosity. That's that wonder we've been talking about. Humility, which I think is huge. In my point of view and in my experience, and I think many of the people I've spoken to over the years, the more you seek wisdom or understanding, the more it should humble you, especially if you're looking at it not just intellectually, but morally and civically. The idea that seeking wisdom and living life through those experiences, it's a humbling thing. And so it allows us to look at the world more clearly and maybe a little less selfishly and reverence in their own studies. So this education, of course, is rigorous and challenging. You probably got that. Should be joyous and wondrous, but it's seeking excellence. So it has to push us. It has to stretch us. It's hard. And it's highly dependent on quality teaching. So the person you put in front of the child is extremely important. I always summarize it a couple ways. One thing that I can kind of promise you as an administrator is that the adult that's in front of your child cares about your child and knows what he or she is talking about. It seems like simple statements, but they're important statements. That these adults should care about this humanity, this person, but they also have something that they know that they'd like to share with them and are effectively able to do so. Okay, so you need quality teaching. The success of the classical model shows that teachers and students are up to the task by instilling a love of learning and teaching students how to think deeply and adeptly. The teacher passes on the priceless legacy of enabling another to respond with philosophic acuity to a variety of different challenges and opportunities in life. Okay, and this last one kind of talks, that's about the civic part. So why an American classical education, or American Classical Academy, Rutherford. Our commitment at ACAR to classical education is furthered by our belief that we have a civic and patriotic duty to teach the founding principles of the United States, including constitutional government, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And instilling an understanding and appreciation of America's unique political heritage, we better enable students to search for truth, goodness, and beauty and all its unique complexity in American history. American classical education centers on the study of great books of Western civilization, including classical Greek and Roman texts, works of literature, philosophy, and political thought. This approach provides students with a deep and comprehensive understanding of the intellectual and cultural foundations of Western society. So what is this United States? What is this great experiment? What is its roots? Things that most Americans kind of take for granted. What is a constitutional government? Individual liberty. Why does the individual matter? Because it hasn't always been so, and it's definitely never been. It's uncommon historically that it's ratified in words in a constitution. So what does that mean to have individual liberty? And this idea of abiding by a rule of law. So just defining terms that are kind of central pillars to American society and government. Okay, so love is the foundation of the wisest criticism, and criticism is the essential partner of an honest and enduring love. Professor, we actually use parts of one of his books. Okay, just a quick question out there. Why a classical charter school? Working with local families, groups, and communities, ACR seeks to help make the classical model a viable option to families through the establishment of tuition-free public charter schools. The establishment of classical charter school promotes the important goal of forming an educated public. So we have some autonomy and flexibility that's unique to charter schools because of that kind of what we've asked as a community to be able to teach. And obviously it's very much focused on parental engagement and results. Schools like this, obviously, if it's not just a parent at home, but oftentimes there's a lot of parents being active in many ways. It could be in the classroom, it could be in the playground, it could be at lunch, it could be in extracurriculars. There's a lot of ways that families become participants in this work. So in conclusion, basically it's kind of a statement. If you agree that classical education offers something truly unique and transformative, that this approach equips students with the tools to think critically, communicate eloquently, and appreciate the timeless wisdom of the ages. It fosters a love for learning that transcends mere facts and figures. And in a world awash with information, classical education teaches students how to think. Not necessarily just what to think, how to think about the most important things. We hope that you will join us and with unity of purpose commit to helping us provide the best education for our children. So it's just kind of a statement of hopefully mutual interest in this work.